Ah, the Mojave Desert. Just 2 hours from my home, one of the largest deserts in North America. Whenever I'm feeling a little stressed out or boxed in or claustrophobic, I like to come out to the Mojave Desert and get a little elbow room, a little breathing room. I love to come out here and relax, soak in some of the scenery and some of the history, and one of the best places to do all three is just down this road. It's one of my favorite places in Southern California. I come out here a minimum of at least 2 times a year, and it's good to come out here and see seldom seen Slim up here leading us in to California's official state silver rush ghost town, Calico. Now, for some of you who are unfamiliar with Calico or haven't seen the other half a dozen videos I've filmed out here, I'll just quickly give you the basics. This town is right up against the Calico Mountains, where silver was discovered in 1881. And just like in Virginia City, Nevada, or Tombstone, Arizona, people flooded in from all over, first for a chance to find some of this rich stuff for themselves, then of course as laborers to work in the mines established up in these mountains and canyons, and last but not least, the people who came here to supply the miners with picks and shovels and brothels and booze. And of course, then you have a boom town. Believe it or not, eventually 3,000 people were living up on the skinny mesa between these two canyons, helping to pull silver out of those mountains. 3,000 people living up in a town where it's blistering hot almost all year round, and all of your supplies, including your water, had to be hauled in across the desert and up the mountains by wagon. Now, the heyday of Calico only lasted about 15 years or so before the town dried up. But interestingly enough, unlike a lot of other old mining towns turned into ghost towns, Calico didn't slow down because the silver ran out. Calico slowed down because the price of silver dropped so dramatically that even though there's still to this day silver in those hills, it's not worth the amount of money required to extract it and then process it. So one by one, the mines closed down, the miners left, the people supplying the miners began to leave, buildings were picked apart for scrap, and in some cases whole entire houses were taken up and moved to nearby Barstow, until eventually there wasn't much left in Calico but some ruins and foundations. Nowadays, obviously, the town has plenty of buildings and plenty of tourists walking around enjoying it, and that all happened because of another ghost town about 2.5 hours away by car, the ghost town in Knott's Berry Farm. By 1950, Walter Knott's recreation of a ghost town at Knott's Berry Farm had become pretty darn popular. So popular, in fact, that Walter Knott was able to purchase that train that I just drove the other day in 1951. And by that time, Walter Knott was so enthusiastic about the Old West and ghost towns that when his son Russell took a trip out here and mentioned the possibility of maybe buying the old town of Calico, Walter Knott jumped right on board. Now, the original suggestion was to put a couple of signs out here telling people what used to be out in Calico, and then using the rest of the property as maybe a campground, you know, for Boy Scouts, things like that. But this is Walter Knott we were talking about, founder of the Berry Farm, a man of limitless imagination. He was not going to be content with people coming out here seeing some rocks and dirt and some signs. Oh no, against the advice of almost everyone he knew, Walter Knott decided that he would not only purchase Calico, he would rebuild Calico. He quickly scooped up all the land, erected signs proclaiming that Calico lives again, and buildings would be rebuilt on their original foundations, and then with the help of a few old photographs and mostly the memories of as many old-timers as he could find, including one lady by the name of Lucy Lane who still lived in the town, Walter Knott and his team from the Berry Farm set about making his dream of Calico coming back to life a reality. The few original buildings in town were patched up, others were painstakingly recreated using original walls and foundations, some were partially recreations of buildings in other parts of the Old West, and partially created of imagination. But by and large, by the standards of 1950, Calico had been restored and then upgraded from forgotten, crumbling ruins to a living, thriving tourist attraction where families could come bring their kids both to have some fun and hopefully learn a little bit about what it took to live in the Old West. Now, despite being out in the middle of nowhere, Calico Ghost Town proved to be pretty darn popular. And by the late 1960s, Walter Knott was having trouble with the federal government arguing over whether or not tourists could park their cars out here. So partially to get out of that jam, and partially to preserve the town for future generations, Walter Knott donated the entire town lock, stock, and barrel to the county of San Bernardino. And to this very day, they're still operating it as a county park. Now, normally when I come to Calico, it's for touristy reasons. I like going to get the Old West photo, locking myself myself in the old-timey jail, going into the old-timey saloon to get a sarsaparilla and admire the portraits of gunfighters on the walls, laughing at the sign that says Dr. Aria. I gotta see Dr. Aria every time I eat gluten. Whoa. But lately, since I've been digging into Knott's Berry Farm history, I've been acquiring a lot of old photographs. And a lot of them have been old photographs of Calico Ghost Town. I've always been interested in the history out here, how much Calico of today looks like Calico of the 1880s, but I haven't really thought much about how much Calico today compares with the Calico of the 1960s as re-envisioned by Walter Knott. So even though really I'm in Calico today for my own research purposes, I thought, you know what? Why not take a little of our time at the end of the day and do a little bit of Calico Ghost Town then and now? And first things first, why not start with the famous Calico Bottle House? Here it is today, and here it is back in 1963. Wow, my first impression is that not much has changed in the past 55 years. The bottles all seem more or less intact. The fanciful star pattern on the side is still here. Seems like very little has changed since the 50s. I did notice a couple of things. Mostly that the roof has been redone. You can see there's no little pipe up there anymore. The new roof is all nice and clean. But it's mostly just like Walter Knott built it. Now, there was never a real bottle house in Calico, but there was one out in Rhyolite, Nevada, and Walter Knott was very fond of recreating unusual miners' homes. Since a lot of these guys came out to the desert and just lived in tents, they had to use whatever materials they could find to construct their shelters, whether that was barrel staves, boxes, tin cans, or even bottles. It's pretty cool that most of the details are still here. From this other angle of the bottle house, you can see the colored glass in the windows. That was also there in the 1960s. Look at those well-dressed tourists who probably pulled off the side of the highway headed to Las Vegas or Los Angeles, peeking through the windows. I have no idea what they would have seen in there back then. Today, there's a shop in there that seems to carry some pretty weird products. But I'm guessing there were no dead clowns in there when this lady was peeking inside. All right, everybody knows about the bottle house. The bottle house is very famous, but there was another photo of the bottle house that showed me something I had never noticed out here before. If we take this third picture and zoom out, look here in the foreground. Maybe it's because of this tree that's grown up right here, but I've never noticed that before. The little shack known as Sam's Place. I've seriously been out here 50 times. I've never seen that. Yet here it is, hidden behind the weeds, and look up top. The Sam's Place sign is still here. That blew my mind, so I kept digging and I found another old photo of Sam's Place. Turns out Sam was very popular with the ladies, and even though Sam himself appears to be gone now, Sam's Place is still standing. Such a weird sign in those old pictures. Sam's Place. You're next? You're next for what? My best guess was that this was an outhouse, but having never noticed it out here before, I couldn't be sure. I'm not gonna lie to you, this is a huge chunk of why I came out here, to find out A, if Sam's Place still exists, and B, if so, what's in it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it turns out I was right. Sam's Place was a real dump. Look at that. Those tourists were posing with the outhouse. Your next sign, though, is still a little bit weird. I wonder what was up with that. Anyway, how cool is that? There used to be an old concrete miner named Sam living in the outhouse right there. I can only assume that that sculpture was created by Claude Bell, the same guy who sculpted the old prospector and burro statues out at Knott's Berry Farm, of which one of the only originals is still out here in Calico. Well, gee, I guess you could say I'm the last survivor. I had a real nose for prospecting. Well, of course I don't have a nose now, but I did once, I swear. Another one of those old Calico sculptures is still standing over by the Calico and Odessa Railroad. He's seen a little bit of weathering, and you definitely can't accuse him of being all thumbs, but he's still here. Speaking of still here, look at the Calico and Odessa Railroad engine. Check it out. Here it is back in the mid-1960s. Doesn't look like too much has changed, huh? Well, other than the fact that I haven't seen any tourists get on this train today in suits like that guy. Even in December when this photo was taken, in the daytime it can be quite warm. That dude is nuts. The little Calico and Odessa Railroad is not historic. They rebuilt this here, sort of mimicking real railroads that were in the area. But it's one of the best attractions in Calico today. And right next door is one of the other best ones. Behold the old Maggie Mine. Just a couple of bucks, you can hop on the train and then afterwards go into a real mine shaft, which was one of the coolest attractions the Knotts came up with, to let tourists through the office and into an actual old-timey silver mine. And look at this. Here's how it looked back in the Knott's heyday. You can definitely see that the historic parts of the building are intact, but once again, they've had to replace the roof, which is a pretty common thing out in the desert. They get crazy rains and then baking heat all year, high winds. Of course, the signs are also different. It seems like the hoist up on the roof is also a little bit different. But by and large, that historic structure is still intact, both from back in the day and also during the Knott's era. Nowadays, they advertise this place as "See the Glory Hole," whereas back in the day, it was Glory Tunnel. But you can still come in here by yourself, very creepily, and look at some old rock displays like they had at early Knott's Berry Farm, and also some old mannequins, which would be a little bit creepy no matter how you slice it. But trust me, when you're in this purportedly haunted hole all by yourself, takes on a whole new level of creepy. They took out $65,000 worth of silver out of this hole, but there's no silver down here anymore, just creepy mannequins, so I'm going to get the heck out. I'm not exaggerating. It's really creepy down there by yourself. All right, I'm getting kind of sidetracked from my mission down there. We're supposed to be comparing old pictures. But come on, can you blame me? It's really hard not to get distracted by things like that. Now up here by the exit to the Maggie Mine is one view that has changed. The view we have today in this area versus the view in the mid-60s is very different because most of the buildings in the shot from the 60s actually burned down fairly recently too. We're talking early 2000s, and I don't think some of these buildings opened back up until like 2005-ish. So although they have a mystery shack down here still, they still have Old West buildings. Due to a fire in what I think I remember being the candle shop, most of the buildings here in the upper part of Calico are of a much more recent vintage. Things like this barn building here are new. They were different structures back in the 60s, but luckily the fire didn't leap over the gully. The restored Calico schoolhouse is still here, although you still have to cross this very leany, rickety bridge to get there. Rickety wooden bridges. My favorite. The children of Calico actually did go to school up here. Many of them had to troop down from their shacks in the mountains to get here. A lot of the old timers' memories talk about how much it sucked to go back up the hill. But this old schoolhouse has clearly always been popular with the tourists, because I've got multiple photos of it. And as you can see, not much has changed in the past 50 years. A little bit of rock work is different. Obviously, the roof has also had to be replaced here. But otherwise, it's remained the super cool, awesome ghost town photo op it's always been.
Now that's what I call old school.
Oh my gosh, Ma, where's your head? Now some things have definitely changed. Look at this view today and then look back at the same view in the 60s. The same dirt hill in the foreground. You can even sort of half make out that outhouse down there underneath the porch of the restaurant. But that view of the school from back then is all covered up by all this stuff. Which is interesting, you know, because all the wood out here is weathered and even some of the historic wood has been replaced. So it's cool to see these photos to differentiate between what's actually, you know, from the old silver rush, what's from the early Knott's days, and what's a little bit more modern. It's interesting because looking at most of the old photos I would have, you would hardly know anything has changed. Sure, there's no Joshua tree in the middle of the street, the ore cars probably moved somewhere else, but by and large, that is the same view you had 50 plus years ago. Now let's look at this building over here that's now R&D, fossils and minerals. Pretty old looking building. And it should look old because it and its neighbor have been here since the time of Walter Knott. Look at the view today versus the view then. The photo ops may have changed, some of the signage may have changed, obviously the roof again has been replaced. And it's very interesting to me that this was once set up as a Nickelodeon. I don't really think of Nickelodeons being out in the old western deserts. I do, however, think of sheriff's offices. And how cool is it that this one is right where it was back in the day, complete with intact hanging tree. That is a huge surprise that this gnarled piece of wood is still here, and it's still the very same one that was here back in the day. Both this tree and the hanging tree at Knott's Berry Farm in Buena Park are often overlooked, but are both survivors of that original Walter Knott style creativity. You can definitely tell from the old photo that Polecat Pete's residence wasn't here back then. So although a lot of the town looks virtually identical to the way it did in the 60s, a lot has definitely changed. Take this shot, for example. Look at it now and look at it back then. You can definitely tell the town was still in a state of development. This is just totally different looking today. You don't have any trucks parked here, which look very old to us now, but obviously weren't that old back then. And if you look closely, you'll just see a bunch of old junk piled up against some of the old walls, a lot of which is probably still here today, but nowadays it's a little more organized. Another thing about that picture is in all the times I've been out here, I've always assumed that this little building was much more modern and recent than the Knott's era. But although it wasn't labeled as a stagecoach shop then, if you look back at the old picture, you'll see that the same building was there back in the day. Only then, it was the Cactus Corral. Ooh. Wow, desert plants, cactus, and dry weeds for sale. This place was the happening spot. Yes, sirree. Calico Ghost Town is one of my favorite places ever. Doing this is so fun for me, especially when I get to see the way things have changed and evolved. Like, speaking of that junk pile there, I've got another picture of this spot from a slightly different angle where we look to the left. And in that picture, you can definitely tell that even though there's been quite a bit added onto it for its preservation, those rammed earth walls underneath are actually something original and historic, hiding under a little bit newer woodwork. Inside those walls is a whole bunch of what's now the candle shop, and out in front is the Main Street stage. And it's been that way at least the entire time I've been coming to Calico. So it's pretty cool to time travel back 50 years and see what it was like back then. Now, it's hard to tell that this is the same angle, but if you look back 50 years at this old picture, you'll notice a bunch of old wagons in this lot here. That picnic table, shelter roof is gone now, but the dirt lot is still here, and way in the back are the decaying remains of a couple of different wagons. It's extremely difficult to say that these are the exact same wagons, but another old picture that I've got shows a lady posing with a covered wagon. And while I don't see that same covered wagon out here, at least in my field of vision at the moment, it is pretty cool that, you know, the essentials haven't changed. You still got some old wagons out here. The buildings in the background of that photo haven't changed either because they're some of the original ones. From the same angle as the 60s, there's a tree in the way. But if we go around it to get another shot, not only will you see the town hall building in that photo, but also one of the original buildings, the Lane's General Merchandise Store. That little old lady, Lucy Lane, lived in that building over there that was once a post office. There's a bunch of different things in town, but earlier in her life, her and her husband owned a store in this building. She grew up here, went to school here, got married and ran a business here, and then later retired here. So needless to say, she was very important in telling Walter Knott what used to be in this area, and that's why, at least the lower part of the town, you can guarantee if they didn't get everything perfectly period correct, they at least got pretty close. All right, now check out this old wooden fun pick opportunity. This probably isn't more than, I don't know, 20 years old or so. I mean, that's just a guess, but plywood doesn't last too long out here in the desert sun. Or does it? I honestly couldn't tell you. But one thing I've always loved about this photo op is the three-dimensional hat nailed to the bottom. It's not exactly in the same spot, but if you look back 50 years, people were also taking some fun pics. Putting their heads on top of somebody else's body for a fun pic opportunity is a tradition out here. Although when I looked a little closer, unlike this 2D fun pic opportunity, that whole thing seems to be 3D. Look at that. It looks like it's just a Claude Bell sculpture with no head. Weird. Of course, out in front of these buildings sits the famous sign with the proclamation from Walter Knott about Calico living again. And of course, 50 years ago, this same sign was in this same exact spot. Another interesting thing is, you ever wondered about that Calico up on the mountain when it got there? Clearly it wasn't here in the 1960s, so that must have been put there during the Walter Knott era, because it does show up in some of these other old photographs from the time. Now, another shot that I think is really interesting, if you turn around from looking at that Walter Knott sign, you'll see the old Calico Fire Hall and part of the Calico House restaurant. Pretty cool view, isn't it? Well, apparently we're not the only ones who think so, because 55 years ago, someone standing right about here snapped a photo, and if we zoom in and jump back in time, you can see that things really haven't changed all that much. Pretty awesome. Matter of fact, going back to the old photo and looking very closely, I noticed those old wooden slats up there in the beams, and they're still here today. Little details like that are very cool to discover. The fire hall seems more or less intact and unchanged. Seems like the doors maybe have been replaced. There's a little bit of new woodwork holding up the roof, but more or less, you know, same design, same location. But it is interesting that the old hitching posts and the old drinking fountain that used to be in the middle of the street here is now a thing of the past. Now, I've got many more pictures of old Calico, but since the shadows are getting long, that means the town is about to close up, and most of the visitors are headed back towards the parking lot. And as long as we're headed in that direction, why not take a look at one more old photo that lines up pretty nicely with the way things look today. You can see some of the woodwork has changed, you can see some of the signage has changed, but overall, the spirit of the thing is still pretty spot on. I mean, the Calico House restaurant over there still looks pretty darn similar, and you can even see one of these adobe framed windows in the old photo, still here today. All right, there was a lot that I couldn't show you. A lot of old pictures versus what it looks like now. I'll have to come back, actually. Which, believe me, is not something I'm gonna complain about. But before we leave completely, I've saved the best for last. Nowadays, when you come to Calico, you drive up a hill and you park right at the foot of the town. I mean, literally, car up here with all the town buildings. You walk in, pretty straightforward. But years ago, during one of my first visits to Calico, I couldn't help but notice that halfway up the town, right up next to the statue of old Walter Knott, are some very strange Calico relics indeed. Look back here behind this old fence behind the photo studio. Look at these steel cables coming out of some kind of old engine house, and then notice how there's 3 giant concrete slabs. And I know it's difficult to tell from here, but on the other side are some tracks with that steel cable running down the middle. Well, because I've been interested in Calico's history, I always knew that down on this side of the town, in this canyon over here, were not only a lot of miners' little dugout homes in the sides of the cliffs, but also a lot of little hole-in-the-wall, no pun intended, mines down here. As a matter of fact, this whole canyon was called Wall Street Canyon, you know, because of all the riches coming out. Anyway, that always made me really curious about this strange track over here. Was this actually for ore cars? Was this something original to the Old West period in Calico? Well, the more that I looked at it, the less authentically Old West it seemed to be, especially those concrete slabs there. But that got me to thinking, what's down at the other end? And that's precisely when it dawned on me that I've seen the other end. In the 1880s, that may have been a place for silver mining, but today Wall Street is just the lower parking lot. And on the first trip I ever took to Calico with my own driver's license, I didn't know about this upper parking lot. And like many others before me and since, I didn't know to drive up the hill and accidentally drove down to here towards all of this. See, nowadays, this is not an entrance to Calico Ghost Town at all. This is just a bunch of abandoned stuff. But of course, though I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, I had no way of knowing that. And my friends and I waited down here quite a long time by this gate, thinking that this was the entrance to Calico Ghost Town and somebody would come down and open her up for us. Of course, that never happened, so eventually we realized this is just a pile of abandoned stuff. And eventually, we figured out that there were stairs to walk up to the top, which is when I found the upper parking lot and then felt like a fool for, you know, parking down here. But anyway, that's how I knew what was at the bottom of those tracks. Look down here on the other side of this fence. 3 more levels of concrete slabs right against the tracks, and if you look way up there, they were hidden from view from above. But from down here up the tracks, you can clearly see 3 old ore cars. So I always wondered, was this how people used to enter Calico Ghost Town? Riding up a miniature ore car tramway? Well, guys, thanks to the old photos, I now know that's exactly what used to happen. Here's today's view of the modern abandoned tram station, and here it is back in the mid-60s. Whoa, look at that. Clearly you can tell this was the main entrance to the ghost town. There's a portrait of Walter Knott right there. You've got your gigantic Welcome to Calico sign right in the dead center. If you look closely, there's a sign there pointing you either to the stairway or the tram as a way to get up into the ghost town. If you look in the bottom right, you'll see the stone walls and the concrete steps. They're still here today. How about that? Also up in the image in the upper right-hand corner today, you see that building there? It was also there back in the 60s. So while this little ticket booth and some of the woodwork down here doesn't quite line up to my photo, it's very, very obvious that we're looking at the exact same place and that this once was the main entrance to Calico. But the fun doesn't stop there, because right next to that old picture, I found another one that was a little more backed up. And from up on top of this little dirt outcropping, somebody 55 years ago snapped a picture of this. Look at the old entrance back then. At first glance, it looks like those 2 pictures are the same, but this one shows a lot more. Not only do you get a wider perspective on what was going on down here at the entryway to the town, you can also see a lot of cars back there in the parking lot, including an old bus, and best of all, if you look closely at the very center of the photo, down on the track, you'll see the 3 ore cars down here at the loading platform with Calico Ghost Town guests inside, ready to make their way to the top. That is very cool. Very Knott's Berry Farm to invent a mechanical way to get to the top. Turn it into a ride. Literally the real life Calico mine ride, huh? You can still see the ore cars halfway up the hill today. You can still see the cables that would pull them up and down. But for the most part today, the Calico tramway ride is completely and utterly abandoned. And the interesting thing is that hundreds of tourists make their way around town just up at the top of those steps. But rarely does anyone see what's left of this. Check it out, there's an old Calico sign right there, barely visible. I wonder if this was once on the pole where the old Welcome to Calico sign was. Wow, you can clearly see the old loading platforms and the old handrails where you would step into your minecart, but I don't think that minecart is ever coming back down again. You can also see a lot of old wooden vats and wooden pipes. Calico did eventually get a water supply pumped up here from wells on the desert floor through old wooden pipes. So that may be original. Either way, this is now my favorite part of Calico Ghost Town, because unlike the cool touristy part up top, this part is truly abandoned. I mean, that's more or less an abandoned theme park attraction, an abandoned Knott's Berry Farm attraction out here in a ghost town. It really doesn't get much cooler than stumbling upon something like that. But when you add in the fact that a lot of the miners around Calico lived and worked down in this very canyon, and you're sort of mixing the tourist history with a little bit of an abandoned spot with some of the actual mining history, I don't know, something about it just brings you a little closer to the past. And not just the mining past, but also that Walter Knott era past. I really feel like I'm in some sort of Twilight Zone episode or something like that. Pretty darn cool. It would be pretty cool if they restored this little tramway right here. I mean, to be fair, it probably wouldn't be cost effective, which is probably what killed it, but it would still be pretty neat. And even if they never do it, it's pretty neat coming down here just to take a look at it. All right, guys, the shadows are getting really long now out here in the West. And unfortunately, that pretty much ends our time here at Calico Ghost Town, at least for this visit. But before we go, we should take a moment to remember the men and women who came out here by wagon to blast a living out of the earth. Not only did thousands of people live here, but many of them also died here too. So if you have some time, make sure to stop by the Calico Cemetery and pay your respects to those old-time pioneers who never left. Like the rest of the town, the cemetery is now closed to us today. But since that gives us another excuse to come back to Calico, I don't mind. Because any time spent in Calico is a good time. All right, our day has come to a close. Thank you guys for watching and for coming along with me on this desert research trip. Just like I told you last time we were here, don't worry, we'll be back. So make sure to check out all the links down below. And until next time, you've done your duty. You can go home and sleep well. I gotta tell you guys, it was a hot one out in the desert today. 110 degrees out in Calico at one point. So if you do come out here in the summer months, well, actually anytime you come out here, make sure you bring plenty of water and sunscreen. True story, I once had a friend, an actor friend of mine, who ate some shellfish. He didn't know he was allergic, and he started getting some hives, a little bit of an allergic reaction on his face the night before we came camping at Calico. The next day we came out here, it was 115 degrees. We're wandering all around the ghost town. His face was starting to look pretty puffy, so he goes, you know what, I'm gonna go run the air conditioner, lay down in the car. An hour later, we go to check on him. He had not been running the air conditioner. He was sitting in a hot car in 100 and some odd degrees. His face had swollen up so much he could not see out of his eyes, and we had to take him to the emergency room. So make sure you haven't eaten any shellfish, at least if you're allergic to it, before you come spend time in the hot, hot desert. This has been a public service announcement from Random Land. It's weird, I eat shellfish all the time. I'm highly allergic, and nothing ain't never happened to me. Well, then you're not allergic. I'm so allergic, highly allergic. Okay.